Welcome to the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm EJ.
And I'm Stacy the Linguist. Welcome, everybody.
And today we're going to talk about something a little bit different than we normally do, a little bit of a historical thing that is very much involved with language and whatnot. But we're going to talk about La Malinche.
Yes, this is something that I do not know very much about. The one thing that I struggle with is historical linguistics, but EJ happens to know quite a bit about this. So they're going to give us some education on this topic, and I'm very excited.
All right, let's go. So first, maybe just give a little bit of background information. Hernán Cortés was a conquistador, which I believe we use the word conquistador in English, don't we?
Yeah, I think we do. I don't know what other word we would use.
I mean, conquistador is really just the Spanish word for conquerors. So.
Right, yeah. I think we use conquistador to refer to, like, that specific time and that specific like type of person in that area, like it just kind of specifies the time and place of what we're talking about, as opposed to just generic conqueror.
Right, which is actually in and of itself kind of an interesting thing. Like when we use foreign words to describe certain events, when we do actually have English equivalents, but it's just more specific in this instance.
Yeah. Just more, specific to the time and the place, and kind of already paints a picture of what we're talking about here.
Right. Anyway, so basically Hernán Cortés is really well known as the conquistador who defeated the Aztecs, Moctezuma, kind of in a way took Mexico for Spain.
Colonialism, people. We're talking about colonialism.
Colonialism. But where this gets interesting and what most people don't think about is obviously Hernán Cortés did not speak Nahuatl or Maya or any of the languages indigenous to Mexico or that region of the world at all. And obviously the indigenous peoples did not speak Spanish. So you have colonialism, but you also have this massive linguistic problem of sorts. And that's where La Malinche comes in. So another little piece of background information. There's a guy whose name was Geronimo de Aguilar, which Geronimo, it starts with a G in Spanish, so I can imagine in English it being said Geronimo. But Geronimo de Aguilar was shipwrecked. He was a Spaniard who was shipwrecked and captured by the Mayans. And so Geronimo actually spoke one of the Mayan languages. And so what happens is that Hernán Cortés, when he goes to the New World, he does end up finding Geronimo de Aguilar, who's been living with the Mayans, who speaks Mayan. So he's able to interpret between the Mayans and Hernán Cortés. But that doesn't really help with the Aztecs, who are, the power in the area.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a woman who had been sold as a slave between indigenous groups. And when Hernán Cortés conquered the Tabascans, she was given with a group of other women to Hernán Cortés. And because she had already been, sold between groups, she spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language. And so then when Hernán Cortés is, trying to communicate with the Aztecs, you get this really interesting string of Hernán Cortés speaks Spanish, Geronimo de Aguilar interprets from Spanish to Mayan, and then La Malinche interprets from Mayan to Nahuatl in order to communicate with the Aztecs.
Yes, a lovely little translation chain.
Right. So you can imagine that being somewhat problematic, right?
It's like a game of telephone, but worse because you're going between languages.
and worse, because you're basically interpreting between two kings with a long train of interpretation of people who are not trained in any way as interpreters. No one can verify their interpretations, right? So you have these messages passing through, and like when you think about that, it's just insane.
Not to mention class dynamics. And these people are also dealing with class dynamics on top of this translation chain. And so, you know, they're worried for their own lives and status, along with, you know, trying to balance these two major powers. It's a very stressful job.
Right, especially La Malinche, who's been given to Hernán Cortés as a slave. Like when she was given to Hernán Cortés originally, he actually just like gave these women, because she was with a group, he just gave these women out to his officers. And so
horrible idea.
Horrible idea, right? I mean, there's so much wrong with this scenario as a whole. We don't need to dive too deep into the moral ramifications of it. But he gave La Malinche to one of his officers. And then once they realized that she spoke multiple languages, he basically took her back. And he actually ended up bothering children with her. And, you know, so their child, I think Martin was his name, is sometimes called the first mestizo. So like of European and indigenous descent. Obviously, he was not actually the first mestizo because, you know, there had been Europeans there for a while, and that's just not really how history works. There are other recorded people, but he's known as the first mestizo probably because of Hernán Cortés's prominence and also La Malinche being somewhat well known in certain circles.
Real quick, her name, La Malinche, is that a Spanish name that was given to her, or because it sounds Spanish?
Yeah, so this is a really, really interesting thing, actually. Her name, there's like 4 different variants of it, depending on how you look. I believe she was actually, you know, baptized into the Spanish
Catholicism.
Catholicism at the time, definitely Catholicism, with the name Marina. But she's also called La Malinche, Malintzin, Malinali, I think, is another one in the records. It's super interesting, partly because there are so many spread records, and she's kind of become a legend in certain areas. But yeah, you see a good amount of people calling her different things, which also makes the history interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that was a little bit of background there. So yeah, like I was saying, La Malinche ended up working with Geronimo de Aguilar in this interpretation chain. But then she was actually really good at learning languages. And so she ended up picking up Spanish. And then, you know, Geronimo gets kicked out of this chain, basically. And La Malinche, this indigenous woman who's been gifted multiple times as a slave, is now the sole interpreter between like Hernán Cortés and Moctezuma, like a couple of the most important, you know, powers on this stage, which is kind of crazy because, like, as you mentioned, there's motivations here. Like, she's got to be worried about her own position.
Yeah.
And so, like, does she have any motivation to give a neutral, unbiased interpretation of anything? Debatably. Does she actually fully understand what's being said by Hernán Cortés and Moctezuma all the time? Maybe not, but it's probably in her best interest to pretend she does. I mean, there's a lot of assumption going on here because we don't have super detailed histories of all of it, and a lot of the histories were written, you know, by the Spanish, and, you know, they're trying in their histories to really feature Catholicism prominently, and so you know that some things are changed, and so it's really interesting and hard to see. But there's even some records show her basically giving advice to Moctezuma and saying, like, yes, you should go with the Spaniards and they will treat you well. And like, how does someone in that position end up giving advice to a king as an interpreter?
Yeah, I mean, she's definitely in like a very unique position of, in her own way, a position of power, but it's such a fragile power, right? Where, you know, a slip of the tongue could like make or break not only like her life, but the life of like the people that she's been sold to, or the people that she's lived with, like all of these like dynamics lead to some interesting situations that I'm sure we only know half the story, and the giving of advice is probably just like one perspective. It might also have been like she sees like a very clear and present danger, and her advice might have also been interpreted as like a warning of like, look, these people are not to be messed with. They have ruined like my life, the lives of all of these people I know. Like, we don't know how, like, what that conversation could have actually been like. And, the winners get to, write the history books. It, like, her role could have definitely been favoring one party or the other, and we just never know because only one side was getting the full story.
Definitely. And we definitely have, written Spanish histories that praise her skills as an interpreter, but the people who are praising her skills don't speak both languages. So how can they actually know what her skills are? Super interesting. But then in some of the like Aztec, some of the indigenous codices actually portray La Malinche as like larger and looking into the men's eyes, and actually portray her as more powerful than a bunch of the men on the scene, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense that she was seen as being more powerful. And I think this is a really like interesting concept to maybe dig into a little bit, of this idea that the more linguistically capable you are, the more languages you have. In modern society, being multilingual is still like, it still has some mixed connotations, right? Like in certain countries and certain dynamics, being multilingual can be seen as like, oh, you don't have full capacity of either language, you're not like smart enough to be monolingual, yada, yada, yada. But like, think about a situation like this, or even situations where people have to like interpret for their parents in doctors' offices. They're like in very prominent positions of power where their translations could make or break someone's health or livelihood. People who are multilingual and who are like translators do have this like this power to shift things, to change things. And if your translator has any sort of like bias one way or the other, it could really change an outcome of a scenario. I remember our friend that we brought in, who was an interpreter, talking about how, they interpreted between like in domestic arguments, and like, if you slip up in like a domestic argument, that can have some consequences, let alone in massive powers where like armies and navies are concerned. Of course she's going to be seen, even though she's a woman and a slave, of course she's going to be perceived as having a greater power, because she really does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's also interesting because like today, interpreters follow a very strict code of ethics, right? Like you're supposed to relay what is said, with the tone, with the connotations, like with all of the meaning attached, and not modify anything. Like there's what might seem to be some very obvious rules about, objectivity and stuff. You wouldn't want an interpreter who's necessarily partial to one side or another in a legal case or something like that. But at the time that La Malinche was interpreting, like, I'm pretty sure she wasn't worried about, an interpreter's code of ethics. Like, maybe she was thinking about, what is the right and wrong thing for me to do in this scenario. Maybe she was, but there still wasn't that kind of studious context to the field.
There couldn't be. Like, she wasn't in a position where she could have that sort of unbiased, completely neutral position. It was actually impossible for her to be in that scenario. Yeah.
And there's an example I actually found in the same time period of a different interpreter whose misinterpretation caused serious issues.
Yeah.
So Francisco Pizarro was another conquistador. And when he was speaking with the Incan emperor Atahualpa, a friar told Atahualpa that the Bible contained the gospel, and Atahualpa took the book in his hands and said, "No me dice ni me habla a mí este libro," which is, "This book doesn't talk, nor does it speak to me." Basically,
Right.
he threw the book, which of course made the Spanish angry, who then like took him prisoner and killed lots of other people. And
Right.
so like there's a question, and there's a book by Guaman that I can put in the notes here, but what it says is that the interpreter proceeded in bad faith, and I'm like translating this while I'm reading it here from like an essay I wrote when I was in college on this.
Yeah.
But what it said is, the interpreter proceeded in bad faith and gave false information to Francisco Pizarro and to the others when he realized that they didn't want Atahualpa to die. So in order to get him sentenced, as an interpreter, he didn't say what the Incan actually wanted to say, asking for justice or mercy, but to the contrary, basically the interpreter wanted Atahualpa dead and said what he thought would result in the emperor's death, which is insane.
Yeah. I mean, from a modern perspective, we would be like, "Oh my God, that is horrible. That is terrible." But when you have your own like political gains, it makes perfect sense. You know, it's very like Game of Thrones-esque, where everyone has like their own agenda and whatnot. And so like the fact that La Malinche was able to be what like both parties, it seems like both parties considered her to be like a pretty damn good mediator on top of being a translator. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think her role as translator was also like completely intertwined with mediary. Like she definitely had to toe the line very carefully and very strategically.
Yeah, definitely. And there were things that happened. I mean, sometimes she's actually seen as a traitor to the Mexican peoples. You know, sometimes she's seen with more respect. But there was an instance as well in Cholula where she was, well, the story goes, and again, this is told by the Spaniards, but the story goes that she was speaking, I think, to another woman in the town and found out that they were planning on ambushing the Spanish and warned Hernán Cortés of this. And so then the Spaniards massacred the village. And so she's sometimes seen as a traitor for this, but some of the records question, like, this seems like a really convenient excuse for the Spaniards to just massacre this village. Like, is this actually something that La Malinche warned them about? Or is that just something, you know, they're claiming in order to justify their massacre?
Yeah. I mean, like we've been saying, she's in a very high position of power, but she's also in a position for, you know, things to get blamed on her, right? Not only is she an indigenous woman, which is, you know, a tricky scenario in the first place, she's also like the intermediary between the two. So if something goes wrong, it's very, very easy to blame it on her and being like, oh, there was like a misunderstanding, or oh, she overheard this, oh, this happened. And you know, no side, like neither side could necessarily say whether that was the case or not because she was the only one.
Yeah. So super, super crazy. But yeah, that's basically the story. Like, Hernán Cortés, despite having a child with her, obviously returns to Spain, and he doesn't bring her with him. He gets, you know, married in Spain, has more children, actually names, you know, his son the same name that he named the son he had with La Malinche, which is crazy.
Dick move right there.
Right? It's like, that's just, it was a different time, but I don't understand that.
I mean, I may be a little bit biased myself, but I think conquistadors in general were kind of assholes. Like, I don't know. I feel like you'd have to be some sort of level of a terrible person to go and just, slaughter a bunch of people in like a society you don't even know. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I don't think it's just you.
Could just be me. But yeah, I think I really like this story, and I appreciate you sharing it, EJ, because I think it's a good discussion opener for talking about the kinds of power that not only like people who are multilingual, but people who are in translational situations, that kind of power that they bring to the table. Like you said, we have like a strict code of ethics that most people need to follow in translation situations, but oftentimes there may be situations where the translator could very easily take control of a situation and no one would know one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Or you could have, a translator or an interpreter just making mistakes because they're also human and imperfect. I mean, mistakes even happen between speakers of the same language all the time. If someone says something and someone interprets it just differently than was intended. So then when you add this name of telephone, no matter what, it is going to change things to some extent. But, professional translators and interpreters do a really good job at maintaining the original meaning and tone with everything attached to it.
Yeah. And I mean, this kind of just plays a little bit more into like these days. Some people are translators out of necessity, whether their parents are immigrants or something. But in terms of like mighty powers, like countries, their translators definitely have to go through a lot of training, a lot of education, and a lot of work has to go into maintaining that code of ethics and such. But even on just the day-to-day level, translators or people who need to translate between people do have this responsibility put on them that can be kind of heavy sometimes.
Definitely.
It's a big weight to bear.
Right. I also want to point out, it's not fair to judge someone in the 1500s based on our, modern theories and practices when it
we'll never understand the full story and the full picture of what exactly was going on.
Right. Because like La Malinche definitely did enable communication. Like even if it probably wasn't perfect, she really played a pivotal role in all of the communication between Hernán Cortés and the Aztecs, which maybe that was a good thing, maybe that was a bad thing. It's impossible to say how history would have played out without her. But it is interesting because a lot of people talk about Hernán Cortés and Moctezuma and never mention, the interpreter that was always there between them.
Yeah. And I think that can be said for a number of different like international scenarios as well. Mm-hmm. Anytime that there's been any sort of conflict between countries or leaders or powers of any sort, especially if they're from very different backgrounds, there was definitely someone in between them trying to get communication to happen somehow, if communication was a goal for people. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that communication alone was a priority of some sort tells a bit of a different story on both sides of like, these people just came in and wiped everybody out, or these people are complete savages, right? Like the fact that there was communication that was enabled between the two says that the picture itself was a lot more complex than either side of the story necessarily has to say.
Definitely. So I will definitely leave some notes and sources in the comments on the podcast. If you are interested in La Malinche and her story, though, there's a book by Anna Lanyon called Malinche's Conquest, which I really, really enjoyed. But I'll put a bunch of, interesting sources in the comments here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing this wonderful story with us. I think that it definitely, like I said, I'm not a historical linguist by any means, but considering some of these, considering some historical precedents and how people have used language in the past, or, what situations might have been like, can really inform us about like how far our society has come, where we might need to, be better in certain areas, and it also leads to really interesting conversations about ethics and power dynamics and how language is a key component in all of these things, all of these big political decisions that get made every day.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that. It's been a little bit different than a lot of our podcasts, but I think maybe we'll do a few of these, just like diving into specific historical events and figures, and addressing some of the linguistic and language issues that come up in them, because I personally sometimes find it interesting.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely interesting. And with this podcast being a little bit of a hodgepodge of everything, I think it's refreshing. We get to talk to authors, and we get to talk about history, and we get to talk about science, and all of these things and language are so interconnected. And I think getting a big broad picture of some of the other aspects of where language has touched is very important as well. So I am 100% down for more conversations like this on the pod, and I hope that all of our lovely listeners have enjoyed it.
Yeah, so please follow us at For the Love of Language on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you, and see you next time.
Bye.